I think it's always nice to speak to you, and you know, we probably don't have a lot of chance to actually speak to each other where we just dedicate ourselves some time and sort of just have a chat. And I know of your research, and then I'm also starting mine. So maybe just for me to just sort of think more about to learn more about what you're doing as well, so that you
Mm-hmm.
know, in terms of thinking about our work in the future together, but also about
Yeah.
your work sort of introduce. So maybe you can tell me a little bit about, I mean, how do you ever get interested in the topic of perfectionism?
Okay, well, to answer that honestly, it probably is a combination of like my own lived experience
Hmm.
and the research that I've done. So, like, I suppose if we go back to when I was younger, um, I was never satisfied with anything that I did, right? So I would tinker beyond the point at which things would matter with things to make them as good as they possibly would be, but never satisfied. I would get anxious in situations where I felt that maybe I wasn't going to do too well. So that was the sort of seed of perfectionism, but I suppose I wasn't really aware of the risks of that way of living, if you like, until I was well into my athletics career. And that I was doing in my early 20s, alongside my PhD. So I was training as an 800 meters track runner. And that evaluative, judgmental environment really, really, really nurtured my perfectionism. And I'll tell you a bit about what my approach was like.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was like I would sacrifice everything for training, everything. I would physically and mentally exhaust myself. And it wasn't even about winning. It was about getting that fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second off my best time.
Okay.
And when that didn't happen, there was like this cascade of self-condemnation that would be unleashed.
Mm.
So that was the kind of background, my personal background. And I suppose, sort of ironically, at that time, I was looking in my PhD at what individual differences make athletes vulnerable to stress.
Okay.
And that's when I first became sort of acquainted with this notion of perfectionism. Because I was like, hang on a minute, this is coming out really clearly in the narratives of my interviewees, but this is a kind of dark force that I'm relating to a lot as well. So I suppose
Mm.
that combination of my personal and research interest prompted my interest in the lived experience of
Mm.
perfectionism, be it in sport or now education.
Yeah, I mean, my personal experience of perfectionism in my own life has been that it has always been something, because I came from a very working class background, and it depends on which culture you're in. But from where my family was, getting out of the situation that we were in, because we were quite, I lived in a quite deprived sort of area,
Mm.
and also family as well. So getting out of that situation was really important, and there was almost a sense of the family and myself having the internal seed of perfectionism, but then the environment encouraging that to actually manifest itself in its fuller form. I'm just wondering, from the sounds of it, it's very similar in your case as well.
Yeah, it just shows how the environment there might be when I think what we know is like we're maybe talking 30 to 40% of it is inherited, right? So there's a genetic component, but
Yeah.
that leaves a lot to the environment, doesn't it? So there you go. Both our stories perhaps kind of support that idea that the environment can really foster perfectionism.
Are there any, are there actually good and bad forms of perfectionism?
Okay, so this is a big, big question, and there's a
Yeah.
lot of debate in there. And I wonder if it might be more helpful to actually, before we even go there, to think about what perfectionism is.
Yeah.
And again, there's quite a big answer to that. But I think we need to kind of lay that foundation first before we get to that question, because it'll then sort of make more sense, I think.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about perfectionism, it is a personality characteristic. So it's a spectrum, right? So it's not like you are a perfectionist or you're not. Some people have it to a high degree, some people don't. But if we really want to understand what it is, we need to go deep, right? We need to get into some deep psychological stuff. So at its heart, perfectionism is about the feeling that you're just not good enough. Okay, it's a
Okay.
self-esteem issue, right? It's not what a lot of people think. There's a lot of misunderstanding. And so the individual feels that they have to prove to the world that they're worthy. And the way that they do that is by setting themselves these really, really high, often overly ambitious goals. Now, as you kind of hinted at there, that in itself might not be overly problematic, but it's the way that the perfectionist approaches the pursuit of those goals that's problematic. So they exercise no flexibility. It's black and white. It's all or nothing. So at elevated levels of perfectionism, the individual's not going to let go. That striving is such a powerful force that the individual won't take time out to replenish for, self-compassion. And that's why perfectionism is linked with burnout. And that's why, interestingly, we don't see that relationship that you hinted at there that we would expect between perfectionism and performance. It doesn't exist. And coupled with that kind of striving is self-doubt. So the individual will really, really doubt themselves. They'll often experience imposter syndrome, and they'll be really, really punitive on themselves with self-criticism when they perceive that they've failed. So that as well can undermine performance.
Okay.
Okay, so I think it's important that we understand that that's what perfectionism is, before we then consider good and bad forms.
So that's quite interesting. Based on what you just told me, if effectively you're defining perfectionism as not a good thing, and if you hear people going, oh, but perfectionism is what drives me to be better version of myself, that is actually a misnomer, because they probably,
Exactly.
that's amazing.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
interesting. Okay, now, so basically, I've got no excuses anymore. I can't go around telling people, I'm a perfectionist. That's why I'm so successful in what I do. I'm not in any way successful, but I'm just saying that
Yes, you are.
that's my argument anyway.
Yeah,
So I can't go around doing that anymore, because
no,
basically the literature and the evidence, it essentially tells you that perfectionism is not a good thing. It's a self-esteem issue, that
right.
people are using it as a, perhaps in some ways, and as a coping mechanism, but also as a sort of explanation to explain away some of the behaviors as well, but also linked to some of their inflexibility and how to manage their life circumstance. Is that what I'm
Yeah,
is what I'm
you
understanding correct?
absolutely, that's right. So what we need to do here, and this is really important, is make the distinction between perfectionism and the pursuit of excellence, right? So if you're pursuing excellence, you're a conscientious person. And
Yeah.
that's probably what a lot of people confuse with perfectionism. So and it's been confused by the literature as well. So
Okay.
let's go back to your question, are there good and bad forms, right? So it's a massive debate out there, because on the one hand we think we've got this adaptive healthy form versus this maladaptive form, and that some of the literature actually supports that.
Okay.
And it'll say, well, the positive form is associated with positive themes of motivation. So, things like intrinsic motivation, self-determination, that gives us better performance. And then there's this darker negative side, which gives us the opposite. And intuitively, like you just said, we think, yeah, that's got to be right. I mean, it's our favorite flaw, isn't it? We talk about it in job interviews. But when you look much more closely and go back to this idea of it being a self-esteem issue, the whole notion that perfectionism is a positive driving force is nothing but a myth, because it's not, if we think about motivation, it's not that the individual feels, I'm choosing to pursue this goal, I want to pursue this goal. It's an internal controlling pressure. It's I should, it's I want. And so then there is no correlation between perfectionism and these positive themes of motivation. And what it now looks like is that literature has confused um, conscientiousness, pursuit of excellence, with perfectionism. And
Yeah.
like I said, I think we really need to make that distinction.
That's really interesting, because if you look back in the last decade, where when Carol Dweck's sort of what's the word,
Growth
growth mindset,
mindset.
as well as Angela Duckworth study of people's grit, if you actually read into their literature, what you find is that they don't actually talk about everything to be perfect, that everybody needs to be perfect, but they actually recognize the role of failure and trial and error into the process of that growth and development of the person. And it seems like perfectionism is direct opposite of that, where if you actually use the terminology that Carol Dweck actually uses in terms of the fixed mindset, effectively they're saying that this is what I have to be, and therefore I cannot be anything else. And therefore, if something goes wrong, therefore, it's entirely my own fault. And therefore, I just
Absolutely.
need to get it right.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
no longer a developmental process, but more of a self-criticism, blaming process that's happening.
exactly. And it's not just I got it wrong, it's in that task. So it's not just the perfectionist doesn't just think I got that wrong in that task. The perfectionist thinks I am a failure. They globalize it. They think about it in terms of, you know, their whole being, which is really problematic.
Okay. How does it link in, given that we've sort of we have sort of alluded to that perhaps perfectionism that is something that is negative, and you have alluded to that it may have got mental health outcomes, poorer mental health outcomes. What are some of the evidence to suggest that this is actually the case? Is it linked to some of the more common psychological um, sort of psychopathology that you have? I mean, that psychologists actually study.
Yeah, it sure is. So there's actually a huge evidence base from the clinical and psychology literature linking perfectionism with mental health outcomes such as depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, exercise addiction, um, eating disorders, and even early mortality. So it
Oh,
is, you know, it is pretty serious stuff. And it's actually been termed as a core vulnerability factor.
what does
And
it
what
mean?
that,
Core vulnerability factor.
yeah,
Sorry.
so what that means is that it operates across different diagnostic boundaries. So it's implicated in lots of different disorders.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, I know that you have also done some work in perfectionism, and I was just wondering, would you kindly sort of share with us what you've done in this particular area?
Sure. So I've worked with allied health professions students for a long time, so over 15 years, and I've seen perfectionism pop up like in different disciplines pretty regularly, but it always kind of struck me that it was more prevalent in physiotherapy
Mm.
students. And I really wanted to understand what's the lived experience of student physiotherapy perfectionism. So a couple of colleagues and myself undertook a phenomenology study. We interviewed undergraduate and postgraduate physiotherapy students.
And who are those colleagues? I'm just mentioning because
Okay.
I think I know who they are.
Yeah. So my colleague Kim Williams from the Learning Development Centre and Jenny Stewart, who's a former member of your department, former lecturer.
Mm.
And what we found was that perfectionism contaminated the student experience for these students. They viewed it as a very destructive force. Now, the paper of this study was published, I think, last month, and honestly, it's like the longest paper in history. It provides a very, very detailed account of the findings. And so we can't go into all that here, but just to kind of summarise, I think it's interesting to talk about how perfectionism manifested for those students. And there was this sort of extreme pressure to achieve academically. I suppose that one's not really a surprise. There
Mm.
was a real preoccupation with grades. One student, for example, said, you know, if I don't get this first class honours degree, everything was hinging on that, that it's all going to be a complete waste of time. And that, you know, reminds me of some of the interviews I did as part of my PhD, where one athlete said, if I don't make the Commonwealth Games, my life is not worth living. And it's really worrying because it reflects this idea of how self-worth can be dangerously tied to achievement. These students got really caught up in minor details, so they would need to learn at a really, really deep critical level, which is a good thing, but it took them ages. They couldn't do strategic learning. Coursework took them absolutely ages. There were stories of them tinkering with reference lists till like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. They just couldn't let go. They would overstudy, they would over prepare to the detriment of their health and other areas of their lives. Interestingly, there was a lot of avoidance, study behaviours going on, procrastination, which is an interesting one. We can maybe even talk about that.
Yeah.
Avoiding accessing feedback as well. So things that have got implications for student development. But this sort of approach to their studies meant that it was taking a real toll on the mental health and well-being of these students. So some of them had clinical levels of depression and anxiety, and there was this kind of overwhelming sense of crumbling under the pressure. And that's consistent with another project that I've done as part of the university strategy for learning
Mm.
work, and an institution-wide project where we found that over 50% of our respondents scored high on perfectionism, and that there was a strong correlation between that and mental health and well-being. So it's a worrying picture, but this work, I suppose, does give a real insight into that lived experience.
That's really interesting because I was just looking at that. It just sort of reinforces the fact that a lot of the categories and a lot of the factors that you sort of describe within what you found for these students fits in very nicely into fixed mindset again.
Yep, it sure does. Yep.
Yeah. Before I go into in the procrastination aspects of it, because that was very interesting. You would think that because they are perfectionistic, they will want to work on some
Yep.
of these identified sort of developmental needs, but actually they're procrastinating. But before I go into that, it may be something that you may not have looked into yours, but is there anything that looked at how they perceive the success of others? For example, in terms of jealousy or in terms of almost like a zero-sum game where if someone succeeds, that means that I failed in some way.
I've not got any, I can't think of any work that's looked at that. But what I do know is that for these participants, when we spoke to them, competition on the programme, so we asked them, is there anything about the culture of the programme that might for you foster perfectionism? And competition was a big thing. So
Okay.
we know that that kind of sense of competition in the learning environment can feed in to perfectionism, which is kind of related to your question. It doesn't fully answer it, of course, but
Mm,
um, yeah, I'm not really aware of anything other than that.
okay. It was just something that it just came to mind because obviously if they feel that whatever their deficiency is and that as you and I know because we've been students before, there is a tendency to compare. And when we
Yeah,
do compare,
yeah,
and then it becomes apparent that someone else's success seems like our own failures, even
yeah,
though that doesn't quite work that
yeah,
way. Yeah.
yeah. And that social comparison was a real problem for the
Mm,
students that we spoke to and other students anecdotally, that I spoke to, in one-to-one appointments in the Learning Development Centre, that with a program, with a discipline like physiotherapy, there is a lot of social comparison because it's not just about how you present academically, it's about how you present physically as well. And when you've got your vivas and your clinical education and all that coming into it as well, social comparison is a much bigger component than it may be on other programs.
and that's really interesting. And I think it's something for sort of health professions educators to actually think about into because obviously in health professions we have got the professional behaviors and conducts as well as competencies that we need, and sometimes that is embedded within how we actually educate as educate our students in order to enforce but also to induct them into the culture and into the profession as well because it
Yeah.
is a culture. I mean, we can't avoid it. There is within each particular health profession there is a culture of how things are supposed to be done and how you're supposed to be behaving in certain manners, and it's actually it is something that I'm just starting to think about that it may be in some ways, I'm not saying that entirely, but in some ways that is actually contributing in some ways to the perfectionism that is actually being manifest in students. And how do we balance that with
Hmm.
with trying to enhance and facilitate the learning of the student, at the same time not trying to feed into the
Yeah.
seeds of perfectionism within them.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it?
I know.
Yeah.
Sometimes, oh God, you sort of start me thinking now how we're gonna do that. Oh, and I suspect that is not going to be an easy problem to
Well,
resolve.
there are some things that you can't tackle. So, another thing that students talked about was the whole sort of social perception of physiotherapy, in that it was perceived to be at the top, or certainly near the top of the allied health professions hierarchy.
Mm,
And that in itself was problematic because it fed into perfectionism and that need to be perceived to be the best.
yeah.
You can't really change that, can you? And also, interestingly, they said that the way that the lecturers presented themselves, they were so accomplished. The perception was they were so accomplished, they were such high achievers, and they were the role models. So
Okay.
so that too was problematic. So there's lots and lots going on.
Oh, it's really interesting that is so intertwined with how even
Yeah,
the lecturers and the academics present themselves. Because I mean, uh, to dispel any sort of misconceptions, what the students are saying about physiotherapists being near the top of our healthcare professions, it's actually I would actually say that's not true, because every single healthcare profession brings something to the table. So I don't think the physiotherapist thinks that we are the best, even though I don't know, maybe secretly they do.
brilliant.
Right. So let's now go back to the procrastination bit. That was actually quite fascinating. Before I go into this tangent about the sort of uh, social comparison. So procrastination, you mentioned that students tend to avoid activities
Yeah.
because of this perfectionism. Do you think you can sort of talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. So this is actually something that's quite well established in the
Okay.
literature, is that perfectionists are particularly vulnerable to procrastination. Which again seems like a bit of a contradiction, doesn't it? Because they're striving, they're overworking and all the rest, but a large proportion of them will just avoid.
Mm,
Um, and that's another reason why you don't get that relationship between perfectionism and performance, because often it's a self-handicapping thing. Okay, so
okay.
when we think about procrastination, we think about, oh, somebody's just been lazy because they'd rather go and do something else. But that's not what procrastination is, and it's certainly not what it is for perfectionists, because it's about a self-protection mechanism. So when these students sit down to, let's say, write a coursework, they are flooded with this sense of fear of failure and self-doubt and imposter syndrome and so on, that can be so intense. I mean, honestly, I have, over the past week, I've spoken to 4 students who have all independently said to me, I'm ready to write, and I physically cannot bring myself to put pen to paper.
Mm,
And it's a physical, it's real anxiety that they're experiencing. And so, as a self protection mechanism, um, albeit it's not an effective one, what the student does is they get that temporary relief from going and doing something else. So it's switching off the anxiety for a while. So that's what the procrastination is all about. And it's a
wow.
similar thing to the feedback, because accessing feedback brings on those same emotions. What am I going to read? Is this going to be a real something that's really going to affect my self-esteem here? So many of them just won't use it. They just won't even read it.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
And and that's
yeah,
us trying to, and that's academics trying our best to improve the way we provide feedback in order to be able to enhance the students' learning. And then and now there is a barrier. and
yeah,
and I mean, I'm not suggesting that it is the students' fault at all, but what's happening is that this is a real issue, because obviously students won't be able now to benefit from some of these work that academics are doing in terms of providing good feedback for them to actually improve themselves.
yeah, yeah. It's a problem. Yeah,
So if I mean, in your personal experience, in your line of work, in your learning development center, that you said that you've seen students who have, because of their perfect tendency for perfectionism, manifest these behavioral traits and even some of the actual behaviors itself. What do you think would be your advice to a student who comes and sees you, who thinks that this, they may or may not know that perfectionism is their stumbling block, but what would you be advised to this particular student who are now experiencing these sort of difficulties in their own personal and academic life?
So I do a lot of normalizing, a lot of helping the student understand that they're not alone, that this is a really sort of common issue. I mean, estimates, how you can possibly be accurate, but estimates in health professions education are around 35 to 45%, that 35 to 45% of students will have elevated perfectionism. So that's pretty high. So some of that normalizing can be powerful. We have to be really careful of professional boundaries, obviously, in this situation. So if mental health problems are obvious, they're a problem, then of course the student needs to seek support from wellbeing services or their GP or whatever. But there are some things that students can work on themselves. And I think it's important to kind of, first of all, be aware that you're dealing with really, really entrenched ways of thinking here. So there's not a quick fix by any shape of the imagination. It's not easy. You have to really work hard. But if practiced enough, things like changing your outlook on failure, okay? So you will never get a perfectionist to relinquish their high standards. It's not going to happen. But you might just be able to get them to change their perspective on failure. So it's about, trying not to demonize what failure means. It's an inevitable part of work. Really talking to students about that is quite a lot of what I do. Growth mindset, as you mentioned earlier, can be really, really important. So we need failure. We're not learning if we don't fail, if we don't make mistakes. We need that to learn. But one of the problems I have with growth mindset is it can be guilty of sometimes, I think, just this idea that, okay, we have to take failure and we have to turn it into something else. We have to turn it into a positive. And sometimes we can learn from our failures, right? But I think it's also really, really important to understand that sometimes it's just bad luck. Sometimes we had a bad day. Sometimes something got in the way to derail us that was out with our control. And rather than putting all the pressure on us to turn it into something positive, that actually it's part of being human. It's normal and that's okay. And it doesn't say anything about who you are as an individual or your worth or any of these things. So I think that's probably the most important thing.
Mm,
Other things like, getting things done is better than perfect. Okay, so that needs to become a mantra. It needs to be really well rehearsed that good is good enough, realizing that that constant tinkering is only going to get you behind and it's only going to sabotage you. We might talk about strategies for overcoming procrastination. And I think another thing is about the feedback and how feedback is your friend. It's not an enemy. And I think one of the most powerful things is to talk to students about how they perceive feedback and making that differentiation between how constructive criticism is not a slight on the person that you are. It doesn't mean that you're a failure as a person. It means that here's something that you could do better in a task that you did, not here's something that you can do better that's going to make you a better person. Making that
mm,
distinction, I think, for the perfectionist is really, really important and powerful.
okay. So from what I'm hearing is that you're suggesting that a perfectionist actually internalizes the task and the activity to become a part of themselves.
Yeah,
It's
the
almost,
failure associated with it. Yeah,
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 it's almost like this current trend of people, because society, there's this school of thought that because society, religion is no longer a driving force within society itself, so people are using work as their religion, and that self-worth is actually embedded in their own work. What you're suggesting is that perfectionism is also part of that, when their students are embedding their work, as in their studies, as a part of themselves and their identity and everything else.
yeah. So their achievement is tied to their identity. Their identity is based on achievement. Their self-worth is based on achievement, and that's really dangerous.
And I see so many problematic issues with that, because one of the key things about health professions is to try and to develop the identity, the healthcare profession identity in our students. How do I then desegregate that perfectionism, telling them that, oh, you need to become a physio, this is the culture that you need to be part of, and
Yeah,
yet trying to not get them to say that, okay, just because you fail in this, it is not you, it is just because you have just failed at a task.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's and I mean, it's mind boggling, because what you are telling me right here is that, I mean, at least that's how I perceived it, is that there is some work to be done surrounding how professions the healthcare professions, every single one of us, as well as the academics that is training these healthcare professionals to go out in the workforce, on how we actually approach these professional identity issues.
Yeah, I absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think we need to. I think more work is required, definitely. Yep.
Wow, that can be quite controversial.
I know. I know.
I didn't realize that our conversation is gonna take that turn. That we are actually gonna start questioning how health professions actually create professional identity. Just now you mentioned a bit of statistics, which I sort of let you got away with, but I just wanted to go in just a little bit just to clarify certain things. You mentioned that you wanted to normalize you wanted to normalize in terms of letting know that it's actually much common than the students think, that 35 to 45% of people actually have perfectionistic tendencies. Are you talking about just within a university setting, or are you talking about in general?
Okay, so most of the research is based on, because obviously academics are going to get their samples from students, right? So most,
That
so
was what I was
most,
trying to get at.
yeah, yeah. So we're dealing with yeah, tending to deal with student samples. There is a really, I mean, did you know that perfectionism is on the rise, and the work that surrounds that's really interesting.
Mhm.
So there was a really influential paper published in 2019, which was a meta-analysis, which found that in samples of over 41,000 students, that perfectionism had increased linearly in recent decades. So over the past, I think it was like past 30 years, it has increased linearly. So it's definitely on the rise, and it's definitely a global issue. So I
Well,
don't know if I've just taken us off on a wee tangent there.
yeah, I mean, but that's absolutely fine, and it actually quite enlightening, because it actually shows that there is a probably a quite a strong culture of perfectionism within universities itself, and through the study of students, it seems that whether it's self-selecting, because these students self-select to come to universities, or it could be a culture, but there is definitely a culture of perfectionism, quite a strong one as that. Why do you think there is such a strong culture of perfectionism in universities, whether it's through external or self-selection or any other factors?
I think first of all, we need to look at society. So I'll come to higher education. But if we go back to that study, that 2019 study that's found that perfectionism is on the rise, one of the authors of that study, Thomas Curran, has recently published his book, The Perfection Trap. It's a good read, by the way. I would recommend it. And he offers a really interesting take on this. He says that it's about the way our economy works.
Hmm.
Yeah, I know. So what he argues is that the economy needs us to spend, right? And one of the ways to get us to do that is to create insecurity in us, okay? So that we spend more on ourselves to make ourselves look and feel better. How does it do that? Via social media, of course, which on many platforms is nothing more than advertising. So we are constantly being exposed to these flawless images, which is then driving perfectionism. Now, I think that's a really, really compelling explanation for what's going on, particularly amongst young people
Yeah.
with perfectionism. Then add into the mix increased competition for jobs, which you've seen over the decades. You then get the so-called helicopter parenting, where
Mm.
parents are, flocking over their children, trying to help them secure successful futures by inadvertently placing so much pressure on them to get grades. So if you think about it, it is in our culture anyway. Then add higher education into the mix. What you've got is this really evaluative context, haven't you, where students are constantly being assessed, just like in sport. And really, you've got a breeding ground. So you've got this predisposition going on at a society level anyway, bring them into higher education where they're constantly being assessed. You've got a breeding ground and a perfect storm, if you like.
Okay. And obviously, that is the general higher education sector as a whole. And contributing to that as what we've spoken about in the healthcare professions, in that sense of culture, professional identity, this sense of trying to be the best, because obviously, and this is true, entirely good intentions where students want to be the best in order to be able to
Yeah,
contribute back to society and contribute to towards the care that they give to patients as well, and that just adds in another layer that students feel, and therefore that actually feeds into the perfectionism.
that's it. Yep, yep.
And I was gonna and obviously being academics, we don't just always just point out the ills of society and what needs to be fixed, but also we are quite as a lot, we are also quite self-critical of ourselves as well. So do you think we might be a major contributor to this particular culture of perfectionism?
I wouldn't be that harsh, Chee-Wee. I think if we talk about academics in general, okay, I think maybe we do. Um, and I think one of the reasons for that is because we don't understand it's these risks that we've uncovered today, this damaging side of perfectionism isn't widely recognised. So it could be that it's unintentionally fostered or it's fostered with good intentions. And I do think that many of us do that unconsciously
Okay.
because we ourselves have been conditioned by society to want perfection. So educators who are perfectionists, like probably much of the physiotherapy departments are, may be at particular risk of doing that. So, for example, do we inadvertently set cultures of unnecessarily high expectations? Do we contribute to villainizing failure? I think we do if we're not even talking about it.
Mm,
Do we get sometimes maybe that balance wrong between how we're emphasizing grades and outcomes instead of the process of learning? You know, maybe we're not doing those things, which are maybe more obvious, but I think sometimes it can be really subtle things as well that are completely unintentional. And I've ironically find myself doing it. So, for example, if I'm working with a student, I catch myself sometimes saying, "Oh, that's perfect." And then I think, why did I just say that? Okay, it's a simple language thing, but have I just gone and reinforced that we should be aiming for perfection? Do you know, which doesn't
yeah,
even exist?
yeah. I mean, I I have been more conscious recently, especially since knowing about your work and also some of the collaborators working in the department, that actually I have been trying to normalize failure much more, and 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 telling students that failure is actually part of the journey and part of the process. I'm not sure if that's helpful at all, but it seems to reassure the students that there is that psychological safety to appear incompetent for a short period of time in order for those feedback to be actually be given back to them so that they can actually improve. And looking a bit silly in front of your peers and in front of your lecturers, it's just part of the process, and it's perfectly all right. And that's the point, that university is that period of your life where you are allowed to fail, because you will get out of the other end slightly better. Not perfect, but slightly better.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And actually, Chewy, that work that you've done with the students has been really effective because I did run a focus group over the summer and that came up, you
That's
know,
great.
that there had been that emphasis on, you know, I think specifically what one of the students said was that academic excellence is only one element of failure, or sorry, of future success. And so that really helped those students in alleviating their anxiety. So that work that you've done hasn't gone unnoticed. It has been helpful.
You did mention that the language was quite important because you sort of sometimes fall into the trap yourself of using that word perfect. And also, is there anything that we need to be much more conscious of? I mean, I'm asking because I'm actually thinking about myself as well. What do we really need to look out for in terms of the use of our language, in terms of not trying to feed into the seeds of perfectionism within our students?
I suppose it's about expectation setting as well, isn't it? Isn't it? And I mean, this is not something I've thought in a lot of detail about, but sometimes every now and again, as I said, I catch myself. And it's not just language, it's, simple things. Like I was recently, I was going through some slides that I'd done a few years ago on preparing for exams. And I noticed that one of the images I'd used was of a marked script with an image of an A plus on it.
Okay.
Now that's subliminal, but that's actually also planting that seed of, you know, this is what you should be aiming for. And I think we need to be really, really careful with that expectation setting. But I think there's loads of other things, important things that we can do as well, which I can talk about if you like.
Yeah, I'm sure a graphic designer would disagree vehemently with you that if you actually put a C or a B, the impact of the image would be slightly less. But
Well,
then,
this is it. This is it. Yeah. Yeah. But just don't put the grade. Just don't put the grade there at all. But yeah, you're right. Absolutely.
I mean, after having a chat, yeah, and exploring all of these, I mean, we have in our own way tried to implement some of these activities and the way we approach our students in our small way within our own departments and with the students that we actually interacting with. But I think there is a wider issue in universities as a whole, as a sector, of this almost scourge of perfectionism within us. And I mean that links and it just sort of reminds me, and that links us back to the past years, and especially during the pandemic, where the higher levels of suicide is experienced within the higher education sector in terms of students being involved. And obviously this is really really distressing, and we didn't used to have to deal with this level of mental health issues previously. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but I'm saying that it's actually now manifesting itself more in its physical forms right now.
Yeah.
And I think all academics in every single discipline is actually experiencing more of that as well.
Yeah.
If, let's say, for example, if perfectionism is one way that we can actually combat this, what do you think we should be doing to minimize this perfectionism in universities? Or is there any hope for us at all as a sector?
Well, I'm glad you've asked that question, Chee-Wee, because I suppose what we've done in this podcast is painted quite a bleak picture of perfectionism. And yeah, there is hope, but I think maybe we have to understand the extent of that bleakness if we want to mobilise any kind of change. So I think this in itself is a good thing. Obviously, we can never crack the problems with social media, with parenting, with meritocracy, and all these wider cultural issues. But I do think that there are things that we can do and things that you are already doing to minimise the problem in education and create learning environments that do nurture the process of learning as opposed to, grades and outcomes. Um, Firstly, and we've touched upon this, but I feel really, really strongly that a lot of the work has to go into reconceptualising failure,
Mm.
as you've done. Failure is not the bogeyman. I think we have to have frank discussions about it with students, because the fact is, if you want to learn, you have to fail. You have to make mistakes. Otherwise, you're not learning. But I do fear that because we don't talk about it with students, we're actually perpetuating the fear of failure. So we have to talk to students about it. We have to, try to alter their perspectives on what it means to get something wrong, that it's normal, that it's human, that the individual still matters, that there's still enough if that happens. And what I'm absolutely not saying is that, you need to go and set low standards for students. No, absolutely not. But what we need to do is do more work to take the stigma out of failure and, model it ourselves, even share our own failures, be open when we make mistakes, don't hide our own imperfections. So for me, I think that's the biggest thing. And then other things that we've experimented with in your program as well is explicitly addressing perfectionism with students. So defining it, because lots of students, you see the light bulb moments, they've got that kind of misconception of what perfectionism is. And when you actually talk to them about it and you see the light bulb and and suddenly the student feels, wait a minute, this is something that's affecting me. And that in itself can be powerful, I think. And so helping students understand it and to know that it is a common thing. And like you've done on the programme and others is to help them understand that, academic excellence is only one element of your future success, especially in a discipline like physiotherapy. And we've talked a bit about social comparison and competition and how that can be problematic and um, feed into perfectionism, particularly in physiotherapy, again, where these things are rife. One of the things we can think about as well is perhaps working with students at the start of programs to co-create values, to maybe create codes of conduct where we're emphasizing things like collegiality, gratitude, compassion, and I guess, like we said before as well, just being more self-aware in ourselves and the language that we use and how we're communicating with students. So yeah, absolutely, there is definitely hope.
Oh, I love it. I love it when you said we need to co-create the values together with students. And when you mentioned things like gratitude and everything, I was like, yeah, of course we're going
Yeah,
to talk to students about gratitude, being kind to yourselves, and I think that you mentioned about reconceptualizing failure. Is I think it's so important because I think it's not just you. I think a lot of the academics that I speak to as well, in terms of one of the roadblocks of students developing themselves and learning, is that sense that failure is not acceptable, and
uh-huh.
therefore them trying to just get it right the first time, that pressure
Yeah,
is just hugely enormous and having that huge negative impact on their mental health because they are not cutting them their own slack. And I'm so glad you mentioned that that does not necessarily mean that we set the standards low because a
no,
lot of
we don't want to do
academics,
that.
I think a lot of academics will kill us if we
Yeah,
actually ever
exactly.
suggest that actually we're gonna set our standards lower. No, but the standards are still there, but we are just saying that
Yeah,
perhaps there is a different journey and a different route to how to achieve
yes.
those standards.
That's exactly it. And we want to emphasize the pursuit of excellence and conscientiousness as opposed to perfectionism and, this black and white, all or nothing. When you talk about balance in life, it's still important to have a social life. You have to have replenishment. You cannot commit 100% to, then your entire identity becomes constructed around studying. That's not healthy. It's not what we want. But the perception of some students might be that's a good thing and that indeed is the expectation, which of course it's not.
Yeah, and I think a lot of academics don't realize how much influence they have on their students because universities are usually, and I'm not, I mean, using university being just one of the stepping stones into entering society in terms of its work, but it is a common route for a lot of people, is that
Yeah,
the influence that academics have on these students, if we can get this just a little bit more right
yeah,
in terms of
yeah,
how we actually influence the mindset and perhaps reduce the tendency for perfectionism in these students, it will I can foresee the impact it would have on their working lives in the future as well, and that
yeah,
they would, and we can only hope that they would bring some of these values and some of these behaviors into their work life so that they have got a slightly much more balanced work life, which may answers and perhaps potentially I can only hope resolve some of the issues that we are seeing in society right now.
absolutely. And I think that's a really good point because we know that perfectionism isn't just an issue in, physiotherapy students, it is in the workplace as well. So if we can address this earlier, then all the better.
Yeah. Jane, it's such a privilege, such a joy to always speak with you. And I mean, this I can go on just having a chat with you for hours on that, but I but I know but I know that you need to go, and thank you so much for your time, and and thank you so much for sharing what you do know, and it definitely has planted some seeds of potentially what I can do just simply for my own students, of how I need to rethink and helping my students rethink what failure is, but also perhaps rethink how we would approach inculcating professionalism and the culture, the healthcare professions culture and identity within our own professions as well. I don't think it's going to be a simple journey,
No,
because
it's not.
it's going to be quite complicated. There is a
Mhm.
lot of things intertwined in between,
Mhm.
but it's something to think about perhaps in the future. But thank you so
Mhm.
much,
Mhm.
Jane, and it was a joy to speak with you. So thank you
It's
so much, and I hope I have a chance to speak to you again.
absolutely, it's been an absolute pleasure, Chee-Wee. I don't get to speak about perfectionism much in this kind of context, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
No, thank you, Jane.